Class, hi. I want to go over some of the harder learning objectives for Unit 3. This covers chapters 9 through 14. Chapter 9 is a little difficult because it deals with some economic concepts, and I want to just refresh us then by looking back at the political spectrum that we introduced first in Chapter 2, but especially in Chapter 5. We saw a more detailed spectrum here in terms of the degree of government involvement in the economy, with more government intervention here, especially on behalf of workers and consumers. Over here on the left-hand side, less government interference, more free market, laissez-faire on the right. The political parties really had not oriented themselves around either of these tendencies earlier in the course in the progressive era, but by the 1930s, that's when you really see the left begin to get identified with the Democratic Party over here in blue on the left side of the spectrum with more government intervention. And it's through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which was the government's way of trying to solve the problems of the Great Depression that started in late 1929 and toward the beginning of Herbert Hoover's presidency through the early 1930s. And then you have FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, coming in 1933. One of the ways that Roosevelt and his administration tried to tackle the Great Depression with the New Deal was government involvement, especially in the first New Deal, in job creation. And that's what's meant by the idea of stimulus spending and deficit spending, based on the ideas of the economist John Maynard Keynes, or Keynes as it's sometimes pronounced. The Keynesian economics basically posits that when the economy is down, when it goes into a recession, that the government should try to jumpstart the economy, that it should do something to get people to spend money, because spending money is what keeps an economy, especially a consumer-driven economy like the United States was becoming, active and healthy, and that gives people confidence that they're not going to lose their jobs, and then they continue to spend. So if they're not spending, the government should spend money instead, even if they have to go into debt. That's why it's called deficit spending, because then that'll get people back to work. That'll get the economy kick-started and up and running, and then the government can recoup that money later through collection of taxes. That strategy is contrasted with that usually advocated on the right, which is supply-side economics. Also something that Keynes talked about, but usually when people talk about Keynesian economics, they're talking about the stimulus spending things over here on the left. But what the right would do with supply-side economics is also put money into people's hands, but instead of spending money and trying to create jobs the way they did in the New Deal, they would instead cut taxes, and then people would have a greater, quote, supply of money in their hands, and then spend money that way. That idea doesn't kick in as much until the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. So that is what we're talking about there in Learning Objective 9.4, is reorienting or reacquainting yourself with the political spectrum, kind of scaffolding on what we learned back in Chapter 5, and how this then now applies to the New Deal. And you can think about how it would apply to other recessions, because in almost every election that you're going to encounter for the rest of your voting life, the politicians are going to have some opinion on this one way or another on both sides of the political spectrum. So demand side economics, supply side economics, and I want you to also take a look at the wiki entry on the 2009 stimulus, so-called Obama stimulus, and see which of those policies he advocated when the economy went into one of its biggest downturns since the Great Depression in 2008, 2009. Now we're in yet another downturn in recent years here with a coronavirus. So it's something to understand. It's always out there on the radar screen. Let's move on then to Learning Objective 9.9, also very difficult, because you can see what happened here. This graph in green, we have the unemployment rates and how they skyrocketed. You can see up here in the early 1930s, undoubtedly the most important metric of the Great Depression, more than the stock market or industrial output or anything like that. Probably the best measure is unemployment. And this is even worse really than it looks, because back then they only counted male heads of household, whereas now they count working adults. But you can see here the effectiveness of the New Deal, which has been hugely controversial ever since. And it was effective. It did help. It brought the unemployment rate down below 15%. And the stock market began to improve a lot in the 30s also. But the unemployment rate goes down, but it doesn't go down that far. And America wasn't really kicking on all cylinders the way it had been, say, back here in the late 1920s. And then you have a regression. Things kind of slip back a little backsliding here, and the unemployment rate goes back up to 18% or so. And this is what sometimes a mini recession, or the recession within a recession, or especially for Republicans and critics of Franklin Roosevelt, they named it the Roosevelt Recession. And it's a big mystery as to why exactly that happened. And I encourage you there in the textbook to consider a wide variety of causes behind it. You don't have to choose between different causes, as long as they're not mutually exclusive. Same with the causes of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. It's really a combination of a whole bunch of things happening at the same time. But one of the things that happened is that Franklin Roosevelt, he never really liked the New Deal that much. You might think he was a big fan of it. He was kind of a conservative at heart. He was really trying to save capitalism from itself by doing some intervention, by tending to the weeds in the capitalist garden, as he put it. So once he saw the economy starting to improve a lot, they basically pulled the plug on the New Deal in terms of the kind of stimulus spending that we talked about a minute ago with John Maynard Keynes. In other words, these jobs that were created artificially, like putting people to work building roads and airports and bridges and clearing trails and national parks and things like that, that weren't hugely necessary, but they were basically just putting people to work. They basically stopped doing that, and the spending on that went all the way from $4 billion down to $1 billion. And so this is a good example of how you're going to get different interpretations of history depending on whether you're looking at listening to liberals or conservatives. Neither one necessarily lying, but both of them telling you selective truths. Liberals will say this is because he pulled the plug on the New Deal, whereas conservatives will say, but it's also around that same time that the Social Security payroll deduction kicked in, and taxes went way up on the wealthy and corporations, and the Federal Reserve retightened its monetary policy, put a little bit less cash out there in the economy. That is also true. All of those things happen at the same time. Now, here you can see, oh, here's where the Depression really ends. And that is with the beginning of World War II. Even before the United States entered the war right around here with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was already building a lot of armaments for Britain. So a lot of people look at that and say, okay, well, World War II is really what ended the Depression, not the New Deal. Therefore, the idea of stimulus spending is bunk. But you have to remember that military spending is federal spending. It is also stimulus spending in a way. The government is who is spending the money to build these weapons. So if anything, that really proves the theory that stimulus spending works very well, even if it was on behalf of a different cause or a different reason. So that's a little sticky in understanding all the concepts around the Roosevelt Recession. So you might want to read that section twice. Moving on up into chapter 10, Versailles to Pearl Harbor. This is a bit of a monster chapter. There are really basically three big chapters on World War II. This is the biggest one, in fact, is the interwar period between World War I and World War II, which helps explain how the war started. And then the war does begin in this chapter in Asia and Europe. And like World War I, the war was going on for a few years before the United States entered it. But what do you see here? in the era between the wars, and this is what I'm talking about in Learning Objective 10.1, is the economic and diplomatic policies of the Western allies. What were their attitudes toward trade and diplomacy? They really, instead of trying to rebuild Germany after World War I, they were definitely punishing Germany. And that was one of the big problems with the Versailles Peace Treaty, not only punishing them, trying to keep them from rebuilding their military and took a lot of territory from them, but also they forced them to pay off all of the debt for all of the countries, including the victorious countries. And Germany was never really able to get out from under that debt. They seemed like they were for a while. Their economy improved quite a bit in the mid to late 20s, but then the stock market crash in the United States really contributed to another big downturn. The Great Depression was not just American, it was an international phenomenon. And the economic depression in Germany is really what created fertile ground for more radical political options like the Nazis in this case. What were the Allies doing in the 1920s and 30s? They weren't necessarily completely isolationist, just with their head in the sand. They still had involvement here and there overseas, but they were not taking up the role of international policemen like Woodrow Wilson would have preferred for them to have done at the end of World War I. Keep in mind that the United States rejected the Versailles Peace Treaty. They never even signed on to it, and they never joined the League of Nations, even though an American president, Woodrow Wilson, created the League of Nations. And so this is an ongoing controversy, an ongoing debate in American history ever since we were big enough and powerful enough to even be in a position where we had to make this choice. Should we be interventionists, and should we be all over the globe and trying to solve problems and prevent wars and fight wars and do this and that, which is more or less what we have done after World War II? Or should we be more isolationist like George Washington prescribed and kind of take advantage of the fact that we have two big oceans on either side and sort of mind our own business? You can understand how people would support the idea of minding our own business, because you guys are living in an era now where there's a fatigue, I think, on the part of the American public and the military for overseas ventures or misadventures in the Middle East, in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. We're a little burnt out. We've stretched our troops as an all-voluntary force. We've stretched them very thin. A lot of soldiers had to go, back for multiple tours and things like that. You could see why people would be in the mood to disengage. And that's why you might think, well, Barack Obama and Donald Trump have virtually nothing in common. They actually have one really big thing in common, which is both of them have not been overly interested in getting the U.S. involved in more activity, especially in the Middle East. They really both would prefer to kind of disengage out of there as much as possible. The disadvantage of that, if you want to look at the disadvantage of that, you could look at some of the things that have gone on in Syria more recently, but I think a better example, an even bigger example, is what went on in the 1920s and 30s, because the United States had not yet taken that role of being the international cop like they would after World War II, but Britain was weakened a lot by World War I, even though they were victorious, and they were no longer filling that role either. And so there was a vacuum. And what happened? There's no top dog out there taking care of business. What happened is bad actors filled that stage in the form of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany and started to take territory. And once they realized they could take, and Italy also, once they realized they could take a little bit and nobody really did anything about it, the League of Nations condemned those actions, but the League of Nations did not intervene militarily to stop them from doing that. Well, sure enough, what happened? Then we have a big problem on our hands with countries like Japan and Germany starting to take over the world, and then we had to fight again anyway. So it's a bit of a no-win situation. You can see why the U.S. is always walking the tightrope diplomatically in terms of how interventionist we want to be. I'm talking about Germany expanding in the 1930s. At first, they began to expand gingerly and take over, especially more German-speaking areas that they had lost with the Versailles Peace Treaty. Parts of what was then a new country of Czechoslovakia, other parts in Western Germany, and what had become far eastern France that had been taken over during World War I, the end of World War I, areas like that. Eventually Austria in 1938, which was also German speaking. But at a certain point, the allies, as you might call them, that being Britain and France and the United States that had been allies during World War I, and Russia over here, began to get worried about Adolf Hitler and that he was getting too aggressive. At this point, he had more or less torn up the Versailles Peace Treaty into 1,000 pieces and thrown it in the trash. And what had anybody done about it? Well, nothing really. So finally, they met with him in Munich in 1938, and this is generally considered to be a mistake. The so-called appeasement of Hitler and Germany, and the lesson learned from it is remember Munich, because basically they didn't really get anything other than an empty promise that he was done taking over territory and he wasn't going to take over any more territory. And he broke that promise and took over the remainder of Czechoslovakia and Poland not long after that. And so people often say, remember Munich, as if to say, hey, you got to nip problems in the bud. In other words, they should not have been so weak. They should not have appeased Hitler at Munich. They should have stopped him right then and there. And you could make an argument for that. In fact, that argument, this remember Munich phrase, has been used continuously ever since, and was a primary justification for getting the United States into engagements in Vietnam and Iraq twice. But I do think that we look at this mistakenly. It may be the case that they should have attacked Hitler then, although it's kind of a difficult place to defend because it's really tucked over here on the western side of Germany. And it's hard to see what Britain and France would have done about that exactly. But I think that it's based on a premise, and I talk about this idea of premises a few times in the textbook. And what I mean by that are assumptions people make when they make arguments. And here I think they're making a big assumption, which is had the Allies tried to stop Hitler in 1939 or 1938, that they would have been successful, that they would have won. And then they would have prevented World War II. But that may be the case, but I think it's also possible that they might have lost, in which case that would have been a mistake, and they would have ended up, perhaps losing the war, and we'd all be speaking German at this time. So I would be careful with this remember Munich lesson, partly for that reason, but also because every other situation that we encounter after that is going to be different anyway. So moving on to chapters 11 and 12, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on a lot of learning objectives with the actual military side of World War II. I would encourage you to think of the big picture, understand why in the Pacific War, for instance, that they had to attack Japan sort of from the outside in with a peripheral strategy, partly because of the limitations of the fuel tanks of bombers. They didn't have a way of attacking Japan directly toward the beginning of the war. They did have that advantage since they had a kind of a gigantic stationary aircraft carrier here in the form of Great Britain. And that was one of the reasons why it was so key to defend Britain. This was the last fortress here in the European area before Germany would turn their attention maybe even further west to the United States. But what you get in Germany is that even though they were bombing Germany early in the war with round-trip missions, they didn't attack Germany directly early in the war, did the West. And that was, there's a reason behind that, I believe. You have to think of Germany as caught here in a pincer between the Soviet Union over here on this side, and they had already more or less taken over most of France, but Britain over on this side. And at first they tried to conquer Britain and failed. That was the Battle of Britain, the Blitz as it's sometimes called. And then when that failed, then they turned their attention and broke their pact with the Soviet Union over here, because after the Munich conference, the Germans and Soviets had agreed to not fight on the Eastern Front the way they had in World War I. They broke that promise and attacked the Soviet Union. And really the heart of World War II in Europe, this is where 90% of the German troops were, was the Eastern Front. And so the Western Allies figured, hey, Stalin and the Soviets, they were willing to sell us out with this Nazi-Soviet pact. After Stalin had said, well, you were willing to sell me out with the Munich Pact, but both sides would have preferred for Germany to spend most of their energy, attacking the other side. But as long as they were now attacking the Soviet side after 1941, then the British and then the Americans, after they joined the war, were very slow and drug their feet in terms of attacking Western France over here and trying to come at Germany by land. So instead, they did important work down here in North Africa and tried to prevent the Germans from getting the control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, which would have given them, ultimately, I'm going off the map here, but ultimately would have given them control over Persian Gulf oil. Germany had an oil shortage, and so this was very critical. But the Western Allies drugged their feet over here and delayed for a long time, especially Winston Churchill wanted to do this, because they didn't want to rerun a World War I with a big stalemate over here on the Western Front. So it's no coincidence then, timing-wise, that it's not until the Soviets turned things around and began to win the war in the East and begin to move toward Germany. That is exactly when the United States and Britain then invaded France, which was occupied by German troops, with the Normandy invasion and D-Day, in other words, and they began to work their way toward Germany in this direction. So really a huge number of casualties that the United States suffered in World War II were after the Normandy invasion and between then and the end of the war here over the course of the second half of 1944 and early 1945. They're not just trying to defeat Germany at that point. They're also racing the Soviets into Germany because they rightfully guessed that whatever territory the Soviets regained in Eastern Europe, they would keep after the war. So in a way, you could think of the Cold War between the West and the Soviets as sort of beginning before World War II even ended, because both had their eye on what was going to happen after the war. And Franklin Roosevelt said this is not going to be like World War I, where we defeat Germany over here in France, but then let Germany stay in power. They were going to vanquish Germany. They're going to take over the whole country completely and knock the Nazi government out of power and then rebuild Germany in their image. But as it turns out, the Soviets had the same plan over here. They let the Soviets finish them off, and they were the ones who conquered Berlin, and the Battle of Berlin finally finished off Nazi Germany. The Western Allies were not involved in that battle. They weren't quite that far to the east at the time, and they figured, well, we'll let the Soviets do the honors, because they'd already decided how to divide up Berlin and Eastern Germany anyway, with the Yalta Conference over here in the Black Sea in February 1945. Plus Eisenhower, who was the European commander during World War II, he realized that the United States wanted to preserve as many troops as possible because the war was not over yet in the Pacific against Japan. So there's a famous quote some people attribute to Stalin that he said, Britain provided the time, the U.S. provided the money, and the Soviets provided the blood. What he meant by that, if he said it, he didn't mean that all three countries didn't contribute all three of those things to defeat Nazi Germany, but the vast percentage, the vast majority of death and casualties was over here in the Eastern War. The Soviets lost 20 million people in World War II. Britain bought time not only with their victory in the Battle of Britain, which was the first real defeat for Germany, but also with their defeat at El Alamein in Egypt and keeping Germany out of the Suez area. United States, of course, provided a lot of money with its massive industrial output, the arsenal of democracy, which I argue was really the determining factor in the Allies' victory in World War II. Then we move on to the Cold War, the early Cold War. And one of the learning objectives here for chapter 12 is is to summarize how NATO and the Warsaw Pact raised stakes, provided protection, and increased tensions during the Cold War. Define the term collective security. This is learning objective 13.3. This is a classic example of collective security, probably the biggest example I could think of, even other than maybe the United Nations itself. But is that during the Cold War, this really, instead of just turning into a competition between the United States over here and the Soviet Union here, really turned into tension between the West and the East, with the West here defined as the countries in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And the terms of NATO were really that an attack on one is an attack on all. And what I mean by that is, and this is how it really raised the stakes and raised the tensions in the Cold War, is that had the Soviet Union attacked any of these countries, let's say, for instance, Norway or West Germany, had the Soviet Union attacked one of those countries, that would have precipitated a response from the United States. And then the United States, this map of NATO, by the way, gets a little bit ahead of the game, because this includes the way NATO grew in Eastern Europe after the Cold War. But basically, you're talking about the United States, Canada, Greenland doesn't have a lot of people, but basically most of Western Europe during the Cold War. The Soviets countered that with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, 6 years later. Same rules would have applied there. So had the United States, for instance, invaded East Germany, then the Soviets would have responded and considered that an attack on their own soil. So this is a multilateral pact with multiple countries. Good example of collective security. Sort of raised the stakes during the Cold War, even though it also provided a security blanket. Especially, you could see why European countries kind of liked this. And one of the reasons that they were able to, spend some of their tax money on things like universal health care insurance and things like that, and spend a little bit less on military spending, was that the United States had their back. Although later, countries like Britain and France developed their own hydrogen bombs and all of that. The question is, should the United States remain in NATO in the present? This has become controversial, especially during the presidency of Donald Trump. Because one of the reasons Russia and Vladimir Putin like Trump is that he would prefer to dismantle NATO, although his advisors talked him out of that. But he would see that as something that's outlived its usefulness. But NATO does still provide, on the one hand, collective protection from Russia if they do prove to be a threat. But it's also something that allows these countries to work together in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. If they can't rally the entire United Nations to fight, NATO does still fight as a bloc in various parts of the world. So we will revisit that a little bit when we get up all the way to the end of the course in the last chapter on the New World Order, and how Vladimir Putin really feels like the U.S. betrayed its promise by expanding up into Eastern Europe and the Baltic states here after the Cold War, which they had verbally promised not to do. The next chapter talks about some of the complexities of the Cold War and how we always tell ourselves, well, what was the Cold War about? It was about supporting democracy against communism. And what I do there in Learning Objective 14.1 is encourage you to not really think of communism as the opposite of democracy. A lot of people do interpret it that way. I don't. I think of capitalism as the opposite of communism, and those are two economic systems. And I think of dictatorships as the opposite of democracy. And this gets really complicated during the Cold War, because in theory, we were fighting the Cold War on behalf of democracy, but in several places around the world, the United States or its allies helped overthrow democracies and replace them with dictatorships. And so you might ask yourself, well, why were they doing that? And that's because democracy has the potential to interfere with capitalism in the form of corporate profits, either with the British company, British Petroleum, in countries like Iran, because when they got a democracy in 1953, then they wanted to keep some of their oil reserves or make more money off of those, rather than let the British just plunder their oil supplies. And so the United States and Britain overthrew a democracy and put the royal family, which had become sort of figureheads at that point, gave them greater power. And then they maintained a more favorable oil relationship with the West. Similar thing happened with Lumumba in the Congo. In fact, that was the first country, the former Belgian Congo, to become a democracy in Africa. And it was unfortunate that the American CIA overthrew that democracy to benefit Belgian mining and copper companies and things like that, because that democracy threatened to interfere with those profits. Similar thing that the United States did in Guatemala, which was a country that the United Fruit Company of Boston, if you're familiar with Chiquita bananas, they owned a huge part of Guatemala. Well, of course, if they had a democracy, which you would think we would want to see take root in Latin America, then they were going to take that land back. So we overthrew that democracy there and installed a dictatorship that would keep the profits flowing. This happened in various countries around the world. These three examples aren't exhaustive, but it is a good example of how complicated the Cold War is and how complicated it is to just simply say that we were fighting for democracy against communism. Having said that, the United States' ultimate victory in the Cold War by 1991 was indeed favorable to fostering democracy worldwide, compared with what would have happened had the Soviets taken over, because they had no interest at all in democracy. Another interesting learning objective in that chapter involves the military-industrial complex, learning objective 14.3 in other words. And it's interesting that the whole phrase military-industrial complex, it sounds like something that you know, a leftist political professor or history professor or something would talk about. But really it was Dwight Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, as I mentioned, and then parlayed that fame and popularity into 2 terms as a Republican president of the United States in the 1950s. So he was very familiar with the military and how military spending works. You can see a potential conflict of interest here. Now, you guys know that the government doesn't have its own factories or anything like that. They don't make their own weapons. They don't make much of anything on their own. Whenever they want something built, they're going to contract that out to a third party, to a company that's going to make it for them. And we saw this happen in a big way in World War II with the arsenal of democracy. There's a potential conflict of interest there because these large military contractors, let's say companies like, for instance, Lockheed or Boeing or Northrop Grumman or any big company like that builds things for the military, they can lobby congressmen, which is, say, when they're running for office. Technically, we call it campaign donations, but we in effect have a system of legalized bribery in the United States. You pay to play. You pay people who are running for Congress, and in exchange for that, they write laws that benefit you or earmark money that benefits you in a good way. So these same congressmen that these military contractors are paying, they're the ones in charge of dispensing money to the Department of Defense, especially those that sit on certain key committees. And that creates then a conflict of interest there because the Department of Defense, these congressmen are much more likely to convince the military to get into military conflicts or play up the threat of military conflicts like during the Cold War, because that then is going to benefit these military contractors over here. I come from Washington State. I can guarantee you that Boeing profited a lot from the Cold War. They liked the Cold War. So you see things like National Security Council document number 68 that calls for greater military spending and really amping up the Cold War effort in the early 1950s definitely benefited those corporations. So Dwight Eisenhower is very conscious of this potential conflict of interest, and he warned about it in his farewell address of 1961. Nobody really paid attention to it because really the media was more focused on this exciting young new president who was coming in for his inauguration, John Kennedy. But the phrase later became popular, and it's an ongoing issue. It'll never go away. It was a big deal, for instance, during the Iraq War of 2003, not so much because of weapons manufacturers, but because of construction companies who got the contracts to rebuild Iraq after the invasion of 2003 were very tightly connected to the politicians like Dick Cheney that chose to invade Iraq in the first place, companies like Halliburton, Kellogg, Brown and Root, etc. So it can happen with all kinds of companies, but it's most famously associated with weapons manufacturers. It has kind of a negative connotation, of course, but you have to remember that this same sort of military spending is really what constituted the arsenal of democracy that we just talked about back in World War II and credited it with winning World War II. So it's not necessarily bad for private companies to make these weapons. It's just if they're encouraging the government to get into wars like certain companies were that made chemicals during the Vietnam War, then that can create a conflict of interest. So I've talked long enough. Hopefully that will help you prepare for the Unit 3 exam. Good luck on the exam.